the live stream.
Okay, good morning. Time now 8 a.m. On Tuesday, April 30th, 2024 in Japan Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo Online Morning Seminar. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. Every year in April and October, the World Bank's Regional Chief Economist offices publishes Regional Economic Update, summarizing the economic outlook and perspectives, and also the key issues of the respective regions. And then this morning, we are going to feature the Latin America and the Caribbean Economic Review, April 2024 edition, titled Competition, the Missing Ingredient for Growth. This report was published on the April 10th, 2024. We have the William Maloney, who is the chief economist for the Latin America and the Caribbean regions, with us connecting from Washington, who is going to share the main point of the report for the next 30-40 minutes or so. Then after his presentation, I'll read the question that we received from the viewers. And if you did not have opportunities to send your questions in advance, please send your questions using the online form posted on the announcement page of the seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen, or you can send your question to me by email so that I will read your question on your behalf, asking Bill to respond. So with that, I would like to invite formally Bill to come in to start the presentation. Bill, please come in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Koichi-san, and good morning to everybody. Let me share my screen. Okay. So as with all our reports, our spring reports and our fall reports, we have two sections. The first is kind of the macro situation, the state of the region, if you will. And then the second chapter deals with a particular topic. And today, in this particular version, the question is about competition and whether a lack of competition in Latin America is part of why Latin America grows so slowly. So let me start with the state of the region. And I think the bottom line is that we are winning the battle on inflation, but growth remains low. So just to show you what's going on, in January, we're a little bit far from that, but we were at 3.5% as a region, of course, leaving out Argentina and Venezuela. And that is better than the OECD, which is at 5.7% at that time. In February, we're at 3.3%, and we continue to decline. And that has allowed us to have a slow decrease in interest rates, particularly in Brazil, which is the top black line, which started early, and in Chile, which is the red line, which you see having decreased starting also about in June or July. And now we're starting to see Peru decreasing as of last August, and other countries we're hoping will soon follow. So interest rates have begun the decline that they haven't yet in the advanced countries. However, interest rates are still high, and external headwinds are going to continue to dampen growth in 2024. If you look at G7 growth, we're predicting it to be pretty flat and low. If you look at China's growth, we all know that it's very uncertain, but it's been stumbling, and it's not likely to be higher than last year. It's likely to be lower. US monetary policy, we'd hoped as of the beginning of Q1 24 would be in decline, but it's actually not sure at this point because of the last performance of inflation. So that's likely to remain higher than even this picture shows. And commodity prices, because of all of the above, have remained relatively flat. So our expected growth rates for 2024 are about 1.6%, and for 2025, about 2.7%. Now, those of you who have been paying close attention will note that we predicted about 2.2% for 2024 6 months ago. What's happened is that Argentina, shock treatment, if you will, has caused a fall in their growth to minus 2.2%, more or less. And if you take out Argentina, 2.2 is roughly what we're expected to grow as a region. Now, this is, of course, lower than the world, but more importantly, it's just not enough to eliminate poverty and promote social mobility. And this is part of a long-standing problem. Again, in the 2010s, we grew at 2.2% when the rest of the world is growing at 3.1%. So we have a problem of secular, long-run, low rates of growth, even leaving aside COVID and the inflation problem right now. And this is a structural problem that we need to deal with. Growth, just for reference, coming out of COVID, remains the lowest in the world. East Asia and the Pacific is about 32% above 2019, and LAC is about 11% above 2019. So this is, again, low growth. It's a problem. Further, the recovery is still not complete. The fiscal and the debt situation remains challenging. Deficits remain high. There have been some increases in tax revenues, but spending has stayed equally strong, and debt service with the high interest rates remains heavy. That means there's very limited fiscal space for investment, and this means we continue to have current account deficits because of low savings by government. Few countries have returned to 2019 levels of debt. Jamaica has done better than that, but most are still at 2019 levels, which was about 10% above pre-19 levels. So debt is going to continue to be a problem. Financial sectors, we think, are still sound despite a rise in household and consumer defaults. And that was due, again, to high interest rates that suddenly affected households that had indebted themselves when money was really cheap. Social indicators have only slowly returned to pre-pandemic levels. Employment has largely recovered, less for the low-skilled and the aging population, and wage recovery lags for women and high-skilled workers. Poverty is now approaching 2019 levels. Inequality is slightly improving. And just to give you some pictures here, Brazil, this is financial sectors, just looking at firm and household defaults or non-performing loans. And you see that every time where we had the sharp red line, which was a rise in interest rates, we started seeing, with less of a case in Mexico, we started seeing a rise in household non-performing loans and total non-performing loans. Governments have that more or less under control. Poverty rates, as you can see from the 3 bars to the far left here, saying LAC, are starting to come down. That's a combination of poverty beginning to come down in the region and Brazil going up a little bit because they were so generous with transfers during COVID that poverty actually fell in Brazil, which is half of the population of the region. So between those two things, we're seeing approaching slowly back to where we were before. I'm going to skip this slide, but some new data on poverty in the Caribbean just shows that actually we're a little bit better than we thought in the Caribbean and the countries for which we found some new data. New opportunities and emerging challenges. First thing is nearshoring. If you'll remember, Janet Yellen was arguing that the new realignment of global value chains away from particular China and towards what she called nearshoring or friendshoring was going to be a great opportunity for Latin America. I've seen little evidence for this yet. If you look, for instance, at this figure for total foreign direct investment, East Asian Pacific, which is this dark line, the black line, has continued to rise over time. Whereas Latin America and the Caribbean, which is this green line, which was in 2011 higher than Asia, yeah, it had a big jump in 2022, but it's still below 2011 or 2010 in real terms. And you draw a line through that, and we're still decreasing, except for that big jump. And that big jump was largely driven by a big energy deal in Brazil. And otherwise, I'll show you some more pictures. We're not really seeing it. And this is despite the improved macroeconomic management of the region, again, with the exception of Argentina and Venezuela. 6 years of US tariffs on China. So by then you would have started to expect, see people saying, okay, it'll be cheaper for me to move things to Mexico. More than a decade of rising Chinese wages above Latin American levels. And 3 years since we learned how fragile our value chains were during COVID. So this is all a bit of a mystery that's being debated. Again, to take a closer look at a country by country level, in Brazil, you see that's the black line there. The big spike in Latin America was driven almost entirely by Brazil. And if we look at Mexico, which is the pale blue line, just below it, you don't see much of an increase since about 2010, which is very surprising. If we look, could it just be that this data is not sensitive enough? It's possible, but if you look at the green, this kind of greenish line, light green line over here, that's Costa Rica. Costa Rica has shown a steady increase over the last couple of years. There's a little bit of a downturn in 2018 around COVID and everything, but it's been getting a lot of attention now from particularly Intel and its integration into the chip making process. Also Panama, which is that big dramatic gold line at the top, a lot of that is mining, which is simply recently collapsed because of the closing of that mine. All by way of saying is that with the exception of Brazil, we're not seeing much evidence of nearshoring. Also, if we look at greenfield announcements, that's to say not buying of existing firms, but of people starting new investments, new firms, new industries. If you look at Mexico, you definitely don't see an increase in announcements, nor in Peru, nor in Colombia. Only in Chile and maybe Brazil do you see something happening there. And if we look at the sectors, it's not in manufacturing so far. There's something in coal and gas and in renewable energy. That's where the big investments are going so far. So if you talk to people in Mexico, they will say prices now for space in industrial parks is really high. And there's a lot of demand, they're full up. But then you have to cross that sort of impressionistic evidence with the announcements. And surprisingly, this is a mystery that we're all acknowledging in the region, why that is. Just to show you Costa Rica as an example of a country that is responding to nearshoring and CHIPS Act. Medical devices is going through the roof. Semiconductors, because of Intel's new investment, also increasing. So, is detectable in Costa Rica. It just doesn't seem to be happening in the big countries. I'm going to go past. So that's one opportunity, and we don't know what's happening with it. Challenge number one is that we're beginning to be old. It used to be that the advanced countries were getting older, and we all know in Japan the challenges that has posed to government. But we're beginning to see that in Latin America too. The pale blue and the pale red, pink background shading are the female and male population distributions. And we see that in 1970, most of our population was under the age of 10. And now we see that those people have all grown up, and the big bulge in our population is somewhere around 25, 29, with very few young people, or fewer and fewer young people underneath. And this means that, again, as we're thinking of nearshoring or whatever, the vast amounts of cheap labor that we were kind of building industrialization on are going to be harder to find. But it also implies a growing burden on the working age population. And again, this should be familiar. Japanese case, if you looked at child dependency ratios, so that's the yellow line, you see they were high when we had a lot of young people being born, but that has steadily come down. But the black line, which is the old age people per working person, that's steadily rising. And we're beginning to see an inflection point around 2027 where that's the minimum total dependence that we will see for a century. And from now on, there will be more and more old people to take care of with fewer and fewer young people to take care of them. And that has huge, as we know, challenges for health and pension costs. It's going to continue to reduce fiscal space, which we need for education and infrastructure investment. It's also likely to reduce labor force participation because, whether you like it or not, women tend to be the caregivers in most of the world still. So this is a challenge. The second challenge, I'll skip this, is expanding organized crime and violence that increases uncertainty, lowers the quality of life, and increases the costs of doing business. Just to give you a feeling for comparing how we are in Latin America, the number of homicides per capita is 10 times that of Asia, okay, and about 5 times that of countries with similar levels of income or poverty. And it's the only region where homicides are actually increasing. Now, obviously, homicides are a crude measure of overall crime. They just happen to be a reasonably reliable statistic that we can measure. This is related to the inequality that we see in the region, but LAC is even above what you would predict given our levels of inequality. It is partly related to organized crime, which is expanding through 2 countries which previously were not touched, for instance, Chile and Uruguay, and has become a crisis in countries like Ecuador, where, if you'll remember, a presidential candidate was assassinated in the fall. So this is a major problem, and it's tragic in the sense that at the same time that we've managed to bring our macroeconomic house in order, so we're no longer the hyper volatile inflationary continent that we were 30 or 40 years ago. The rise in crime is going to be a disincentive. And it's also making Latins really unhappy. Roughly 20% of Latins now rank crime as the top social program, and the economy is 40%. So you can see that that this is a major issue that governments are going to have to confront. So now let me move to chapter 2, which is related to precisely the discussion of growth. And this is partly based on a forthcoming World Bank report, Competition and Productivity Growth in Latin America and the Caribbean, that'll be out in a couple of months. It's worth reminding ourselves that Latin America's low growth is largely a low productivity growth story. If you compare Latin America, which is these 4 bars to the left, with other emerging market developing economies, we're growing at, as I said, around 2%, 2.5% maximum, while other emerging market developing economies are more like 4 to 6%. And the bulk of that, yes, there is more capital accumulation for sure, but maybe double what we see in Latin America. But productivity growth is double or triple. So this is a major problem for us. And the question is, why? Now, we can think of 3 basic channels through which productivity growth is increased, which we capture in these green squares here. There's reallocation of labor and capital to the most productive firms and sectors in the economy. There's improved firm-level capabilities within existing firms, Kaizen type programs. And then there's new entry of higher productivity firms, net entry of higher productivity firms. Now, the World Bank has stressed in the past a lot the operating environment, part of which is competition, defending competition removing distortions and resolving market failures. And we're coming back to defending competition. But I also want to highlight what we were arguing in the productivity project series, that human capital and innovative capacity is also critical, both to existing firms raising their capabilities and their productivity and to the entry of new firms, and that these things have to be discussed together when discussing competition. So let's start with what kind of region do we live in? And we argue it's a land of giants and a land of micro firms. So if you look at Latin America, which is the country here to the graphs to the left under LAC, you see that self-employment and firms of 1 to 4 employees account for something like 70% of the LAC workforce. Actually, put in less than 10 employees. Where if you compare, for instance, the United States, 61% of employees are in large firms. So we have just a huge number of very small firms and very few large firms, but they dominate. So for instance, the revenues of the 50 largest firms in Chile account for 70% of GDP. So 50 firms account for 3/4 of GDP. In the rest of the region, it's more like 40, 45, but that's a lot. 50 firms is not that many firms. So what we have is this duality of a lot of micro firms, which aren't going to respond much to competition because they don't have the capabilities to. And then you have these very large firms. And we argue that these large firms are not facing a lot of competition for the most part. And one way to see this is looking at average markups. So that's the price above costs. From 1987 to 2016, we can see that we've got a rise in these markups in the rest of the world, the dotted lines. And that's driven by mostly what's going on in the OECD. That has a lot to do with technology and the emergence of these massive firms, like the Googles of the world, that have very high margins. But Latin America has always been much higher than the OECD or the rest of the world. And it's basically at the level it was at in 1987, while the rest of the world is catching up. So it's always been a more concentrated area with not a lot of competition. That raises costs to consumers and increases poverty. There was a scandal in Chile a year ago, when Chile is the most open economy in the region, but there's a toilet paper price fixing scandal where the two major importers of toilet paper were fixing prices, and this became a major scandal. That should be, we would kind of hope that external competition would discipline prices inside, but obviously that's not always the case. But the other thing is it discourages the emergence of more productive firms. It discourages technology transfer, and it discourages innovation, because if you don't have any reason to improve, or you don't have any challengers because you are so completely in control of a market, then we're just not going to see productivity growth. And in that sense, there's a false trade-off between competition and jobs, in particular job quality, because to the degree that we're shutting off the emergence of more productive firms, then more productive and higher wage jobs are not going to emerge. So we need both, even if in the short run, there clearly will be firms that go out of business. So one of the first things that came out of, I think, this rather innovative study, for the first time, we actually looked at the impact of domestic competition authorities on things like productivity and sales and wages. And we had a couple case studies, but the two big ones I'll just mention were Peru, where we found that eliminating barriers to regional competition increased competition and productivity. So before, individual cities might put up barriers to goods coming in from other cities. That was made illegal in around 2012. And we can see from the figure on the right that firm productivity on average rose quite substantially across that time period. Another example is from Mexico, where measures to stop anti-competitive behavior raise sales, productivity, and wages. So internal competition, increasing internal competition almost unambiguously increases well-being of workers, increases output, increases productivity. We want more of it. But Latin American competition agencies are underfunded, they lack independence, and are perceived of as weak. So, for instance, this is by the World Economic Forum. It's a question: in your country, how effective are anti-monopoly policies at ensuring fair competition? And you can see that in Haiti, Venezuela, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, it's below 2, it's below 3, including Argentina. On average for Latin America, we're about 3.3 on this 0 to 7 scale. The United States is about 5.6, and Europe is about 4.2. So they're not domestic competition agencies are not perceived as being extremely effective, and they are underfunded, and they are generally respond to the executive branch, which means that a phone call from a major company to the president can suddenly mean that your lawsuit against a company will be dismissed instantaneously. So this is a problem. Import competition turns out to be much more complicated, despite what the World Bank has been saying for 20 or 30 years. And here we had a chance to look at several cases from the China shock. So in Mexico, the China shock was, of course, once China joined the WTO, all countries suddenly would experience large imports of manufacturers from China. So in Mexico, we saw what we kind of hoped for and expanded, which is weaker firms contracted, but stronger firms expanded, and that led to good things. In Peru, we found that, of course, the technology embedded in these freer imports allowed domestic firms to increase productivity, which is exactly what we'd like, because increased competition, increased access to the technology embedded in imports should increase productivity, and it did in Peru. Chile is a very interesting case, and this is a paper I was very involved in. We see a decline in innovation, and only those firms very close to the frontier expanded research and development and new products. This is very interesting because the usual assumption, well, there are kind of two schools of thought. Schumpeter said firms need extra room, they need rents, they need excess profits in order to invest in innovation. But Philippe Aghion and his colleagues have argued, look, really, it's the companies that are near the technological or the managerial frontier who you need to kick in the pants. You need, you give them a little bit more competition and they will invest to escape that competition. And what we found in Chile was that actually, if you take the average innovation, overall innovation spending fell, R&D spending fell, patenting fell, process innovation fell, product innovation fell, only product quality rose. But what this suggests is that whereas Aghion and company find that in France and in the UK, about 50% of firms are close enough to the frontier so that when they experience higher competition, they are able to invest in innovation and escape competition. But in Chile, that number is closer to 10%. And that implies, if you have a really low share, then it implies that the vast bulk of your firms are not going to increase innovation. So the lesson from here is we need capable firms to reap the benefits. And if I'm not mistaken, several decades ago, when the United States was urging Japan to open its markets more, part of the response of the government was precisely to increase spending on firm upgrading so that they would be more competitive. And I think that's part of the lesson for Latin America too, which is this international competition only helps if you have the firms who can organize good programs to innovate and escape. Latin America's protected environments have not encouraged building these capabilities, because if you not had to compete much in the past, then you don't have those organizational skills in place. And obviously, in the land of microenterprises, these firms are just too small to compete with large international firms. So the lesson is that increased competition requires strong firm capabilities and supporting institutions if it is to increase growth. So as we know, and some of you have seen this picture before, just looking at the managerial capabilities of our firms, and this comes from the World Management Survey, you see that the good countries in the far right of the figure include Japan, Canada, the United States, Sweden. All those countries have very high levels of managerial capabilities. But if you look at Latin America, which is these kind of green lines, Mexico is above Poland and above Italy, but that's to be expected given how integrated they are now with the United States economy. But Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, and Nicaragua, they're at the level of Kenya or India. And so it's not surprising that a bunch of their firms actually suffered when competition increased. The second thing is that our innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystems need strengthening. Latin America is tied with Africa for the weakest private sector and university linkages. So we have a very expensive, decent, not excellent university system, and the research departments are not well connected to the private sector. Financing further, because we have relatively shallow financial markets, it's difficult to upgrade firms, even if you're able to, if you've got the managerial capabilities to organize a response to increased competition. So that's just two examples of how our innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystems need strengthening. Finally, worker skills. 29% of firms report weak worker skills as a barrier to growth. If you don't have a skilled workforce, you are not going to be able to expand, innovate the way you want to. That's exacerbated by generally bad labor law. The comparable figure for East Asia, I think, is 11% of firms reporting weak worker skills. So all of these things make it so, as a region, we are going to get less of an impact of competition than, for instance, Vietnam. So if competition is so great, why don't countries encourage it more? Well, one answer is they have a feeling about the previous slide. Namely, they know that if they have a lot of competition, they're going to lose a lot of firms. And that indeed has happened. But there's also a power dimension, which is very important. There's rent seeking. That lack of competition is not independent of the concentration of business power. If you have 50 firms that are controlling 70% of your economy in Chile, those people have a lot of power in the overall running of the country. Courts and other legal provisions are used to obtain injunctions against antitrust measures. If you have a lot of resources, you can tie up the courts, and the courts are not particularly sophisticated in Latin America either, the way they are in more advanced countries. Trade protection can be lobbied, just like anything else. Lobbying for tariffs and non-tariff barriers, obviously, is a way of fixing minimum prices. It just prevents foreign competition. And then if you're trying to attract multinational companies, part of the reason they want to come into your country is precisely to take advantage of profitability. And a lot of governments are worried that if they'll come down too hard, insisting on competition, they'll have capital flight and disinvestment. The mechanisms, and these are all through which that power is exercised, electoral rules in the region tend to result in fragmented party systems, and that strengthens the power that individual businesses can have in influencing policy. Media are very concentrated and closely interwoven with business groups. And family-owned large firms frequently have decades of connections with political power. This happens everywhere, but it's more likely in hyper-concentrated places like Latin America. So just to wrap up, competition, we know, lowers costs to consumers and can help reduce poverty. Competition is essential for ensuring strongest firms grow, facilitating technological transfer, and encouraging innovation. Competition authorities improve productivity, sales, and wages, and need to be strengthened. and it's unambiguously good. Part of the reason it's unambiguously good is that the frontier firms you're competing with are the frontier firms within your country. So you're not competing in the international arena. You're just making your, the firms within your country compete more with each other. The new emphasis that we make, which I would add as new to the Washington Consensus, is that we need to build complementary firm and worker capabilities so that they can compete. And finally, rent seeking and business power. To offset that, there are things you can do in strengthening competition authorities to the degree you can. Part of that, for instance, making them more independent, like central banks. So the heads can't be changed when they get too close to harming a president's friend or something like that. Lobbying regulation and a couple other sorts of regulations on how you can affect the political process are possibilities. And just to finalize, because this is important, because new experiments with industrial policies need to ensure that market discipline and competition are central to interventions. The frustration with low growth in Latin America is making people more interested in intervening in the market and supporting firms. If we're going to do that, then we have to ensure that there's a market discipline either through competition or the kind of export targeting that, for instance, Korea and some other firms did. Namely, if you don't meet certain export targets, you lose the support of the government. Anyway, so I'll leave it there. Thank you all very much. You can get this, of course, free online along with the old ones. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill, for sharing the main findings of the report from both chapters, Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. We received some questions from the viewers in advance, so let me read those questions. Some of the questions you sort of already addressed during the presentation, but let me read the questions. First one, the report says the economic growth in the region is the slowest compared to the other regions. What makes the Latin America region the slowest among the regions? It seems that low investment, low consumption, commodity prices, uncertainty among the major countries are not necessarily unique to the LAC region. Any comment, please?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things which we stress and have stressed in previous publications that hurt LAC. One, it is not the case that being heavily in commodities is essentially a barrier to growth, the resource curse. And the example, which I like to use, and I think I've used before, is that Chile was the largest exporter of copper in 1860, but the second largest exporter was Japan. And so Japan at that point was a natural resource exporter. Yet you see major firms like Hitachi, Fujitsu, and Sumitomo having started as copper companies and eventually diversified and become major Zaibatsu and major impulsors of growth. None of that happened in Latin America. And part of it, if you look at just the number of engineers or the technical training that Latin America had at that time, it was really low compared to the advanced economies. So I think they had trouble managing the technologies of the Industrial Revolution. And they haven't actually improved that much in 100 years. So for instance, right now, the PISA scores in Latin America are about 100 points below the PISA scores for East Asia. Okay, so that's 500 versus 400. This matters when you think that Vietnam right now is about, I think, 470, if I remember correctly, something like that. So if you have a choice between moving your operation from China to Mexico, where you have violence and you have low skilled labor, or moving it over to Vietnam, where it's very tranquil and you have a very educated workforce at this point, it's not so hard to see why that might be the case. So you can see right then that a lot of, you can actually tell stories between relatively high taxes, the high cost of capital, the relatively modest level of human capital, and then this competition dimension that we're talking about. All these things, and also I should just mention that we spend about 3.5% of GDP on infrastructure in the region. Most of the regions spend more like 7%, and we have quite bad infrastructure. So all those things make it so as a nearshoring outpost, we're nowhere near as attractive as we would hope to be. And just in terms of building on our installed comparative advantage, for instance, commodities, or even the new possibilities we're going to have coming from the green energy transition, we're not really well positioned to generate high rates of growth. And we need to work on all those fronts. And it's why, for instance, that the increasing dependency ratios are happening at exactly the wrong time, when we already have a lot of debt and we have no fiscal space. And now we're going to have to take care of more and more old people. So that's going to further complicate things.
Thank you very much. Next question. Strengthening competition agencies is mentioned as one of the key areas for action to improve the competition framework. Would you please share good examples of competition agencies in the region or in other regions? Any comment, please?
Well, so so I can't get into the details of how these agencies run in particular, and what the Peruvian case and the Mexican cases are two agencies which have managed to have enough independence so they could force those particular experiments that we saw. Whether they could do a lot more is open question. Really, the evidence we have on how good they are is that subjective question that I showed you from the World Economic Forum, that showed that most of them, even, if you look back on that, I think Chile was not so different from Europe, right? And a couple others that were not so good. I'd have to check. I can check right now, actually. Let me just check. Right, so Costa Rica and Chile, and even Panama are all around 4 to 4.4, whereas Europe is about 4.2. So strangely, actually, Jamaica and Brazil are also not bad. Peru and Mexico are about 3.8, 3.4. So those are not bad by European standards. Still, they're relatively underfunded. So these are, again, subjective responses. So you really don't know what they're used to. If you took these respondents and you put them in the United States, would they still think that Chile was, was as close? I don't know. It's hard to know.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So the next question. I'd like to ask you about the current situation and the future perspectives of the poverty in the region. Is the LAC region on the right track to alleviate the extreme poverty by 2030? If not, what are the most important actions required?
So growth. You grow 2% and you have a population growth of like 0.8%. That's per capita income growth of 1.2%, highly unequally distributed. You're not making much progress, right? It's like China could only reduce poverty the way it did because it was growing at 8 to 10% for several decades. We're nowhere close to that. And then I would say, if you could get more investment, and if you could get better infrastructure, and if you could get better innovation systems and more competition, the link to poor families is through human capital. And this is an investment that we just haven't made in the region. To my mind, the fact that our PISA scores remain as low as they do, as low as they are, not only conditional, not only given our level of income, but just absolutely we are bad globally, is just a major impediment to moving forward. both in terms of generating new entrepreneurs, but also in terms of, even if you were getting faster growth, even if we had all this nearshoring, would the poor be able to productively be employed by these new companies, or would they be able to be productively employed by these new firms in green hydrogen or other alternative energy sources that are emerging? And that, I think the answer is still no.
Okay, thank you, Bill. You responded to the question that we received in advance. So before wrapping up, any final remarks, final comments from you, then we wrap up.
No, just to summarize again, the region overall has made a lot of progress on the macro front. Are not the hyperinflationary region we were before. So we have to put a positive spin on that. I think there are big opportunities for the region if we can hold on to that macro stability. But we have to do all these other investments in infrastructure and education and innovation and competitive environment if we really want to get growth above 2.5%.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This morning, we had the pleasure of having William Maloney, the Chief Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean region of the World Bank, connecting from Washington, D.C., sharing the main point of the latest edition of the Latin America and the Caribbean Economic Review, competition, the missing ingredient for the growth. Bill, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Koichi-san.
Thank you very much. So this week we are going to have one more morning seminar, to continue our journey through different regions. It will be May 2nd, Thursday at 8 a.m. in Japan Standard Time. We are going to feature the Europe and Central Asia economic update. So with that, once again, thank you very much. And then see you on Thursday this week at 8 a.m. Thank you.